You poor, wretched girl. How long would it take you to clean this room? And are you stupid or were you just born slow?
Lamini stood at the bedroom doorway in her silk gown, one hand on her hip and the other wrapped around a steaming mug of rooibos tea she had not made herself, pointing at a tiny smudge on the mirror that only she could see. Amara, down on both knees with a scrubbing brush in one hand and a rag in the other, looked up at the mirror, looked at the smudge, and looked back down at the floor without a word. Not because she had nothing to say. She had plenty to say. She had a whole speech rehearsed somewhere between her ribs and her throat, a speech that started with Mrs. Dlamini, with the greatest respect, and ended with something that would have gotten her fired before lunch. But Amara Dubé, 22 years old, Soweto-born and stubborn as red clay soil, had learned a long time ago that some battles were not worth the energy when you had a bigger war to win. So she swallowed it, the way she swallowed everything, quietly, completely, without making a face. "Yes, ma'am, I will redo it immediately, sorry, ma'am." Mrs. Dlamini made a sound somewhere between a hiss and a laugh, the kind of sound that was designed to make a person feel small, then turned on her expensive slippers and disappeared down the hallway, calling out behind her, "And when you are done with my room, the guest bathroom wants attention, and I mean proper attention, not that half-half job you people like to do." You people. Amara pressed the rag harder against the floor, not because it needed more pressure, but because her hands needed something to do while her jaw stayed locked. She had been in this house for 2 years, 2 years of 6 in the morning starts and 10 at night finishes, 2 years of eating her meals standing in the kitchen because there was no chair assigned to her, 2 years of you people, and how long does it take, and did nobody teach you anything? And in 2 years, she had never once raised her voice, broken a plate in frustration, or called her mother to cry, even though she had wanted to do all three sometimes in the same afternoon. Because every single rand that Mrs. Dlamini grudgingly handed over at the end of the month, every crisp note that smelled faintly of the older woman's perfume, was already spoken for before it even touched Amara's palm. Layla's university fees paid. Layla's textbooks bought. Layla's rent in the student residence covered. Layla's data, so she could study online, topped up every week. Layla. Amara said her sister's name in her head the way other people said a prayer, quietly, with intention, because Layla was the reason she was here, the reason she woke up at 5:45 before the Johannesburg sun had even decided what it wanted to do with the day, the reason she had taken a job that paid her in money and insulted her for free. Their mother, Grace Dubé, had died 4 years ago from an illness that a hospital visit might have caught early, but they could not afford hospital visits, leaving behind a 2-room house in Soweto, a small debt to a neighbor named Mr. Kumalo, who was very patient about it, and 2 daughters, Amara, who was 18, and Layla, who was 14, holding each other at the funeral like if they let go the world might swallow them both whole. Amara had been the one to hold on tighter. She was always the one who held on tighter. Even as children, it was Amara who walked Layla to school and waited outside the gate until the bell rang. Amara who checked Layla's homework even when her own was not finished. Amara who told their mother, "I'll manage," so many times that it stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like her personality. Layla was the bright one. Everyone said so, teachers, neighbors, even Mr. Kumalo, who once told Grace, "That small girl of yours is going to be somebody you watch," and Grace had beamed the kind of beam that only mothers of brilliant children can produce. Layla had passed her matric with distinctions that made the neighbors come out of their houses to congratulate Grace's grave, because Grace was not there to receive it herself. And when the university acceptance letter arrived, Amara had read it 3 times, sitting on the edge of their shared bed, and decided right there in that quiet that Layla was going, even if Amara had to carry the weight of the whole plan on her own back, which was exactly what she was doing, down on her knees in a Santon mansion, scrubbing a floor that was already clean, for a woman who would find fault in a freshly ironed cloud. The funny thing, the thing that would have made anyone who knew Amara laugh and feel sad at the same time, was that Amara was actually smart, genuinely sharp in the way that makes teachers lean forward when you speak, the kind of girl who finished exams early not because she was rushing, but because she actually knew the answers, the kind of person who read anything she could find not because someone told her to, but because her mind was always hungry for more. But smart does not pay fees. Smart does not keep a 14-year-old girl from dropping out when there is no money and no parent and nowhere to turn. So Amara had made a choice, the way people with no options make choices, not freely, not happily, but with a kind of fierce love that looks from the outside like sacrifice and feels from the inside like the only possible thing to do. She had taken the job through a placement agency, packed a small bag, moved into the small room behind Mrs. Dlamini's kitchen that had a single window facing the wall of the next building, and started the business of disappearing into someone else's life so that Layla could build her own. The small room had a single bed, a plastic chair, a small table, and a naked bulb that flickered every time someone in the main house turned on the microwave, which Mrs. Dlamini did at least 9 times a day because the woman lived on reheated food and dramatic complaints about reheated food. Amara had made the room her own in small, quiet ways. A photograph of her mother on the table, a library book borrowed from the public library 2 streets away that she had to return every 2 weeks and always did, always on time, because late fees were a luxury she could not afford, and a small notebook where she wrote down things she wanted to remember, quotes, words she liked the sound of, ideas that came to her at strange hours. She wrote in that notebook the way some people pray, every night before the flickering bulb went out. That night, like most nights, she was still awake at midnight when the rest of the house had gone quiet, and Mrs. Dlamini's television had finally stopped its noise, sitting on the plastic chair with the notebook open and a borrowed copy of a business management textbook on the table, reading by the flickering light with the concentration of someone who knows that every page is a stolen gift. She had found the textbook in a box of things Mrs. Dlamini was throwing out and had asked very carefully, very politely, "Ma'am, may I take this, since you are disposing of it?" And Mrs. Dlamini had looked at the book and looked at Amara with an expression that said she found the request slightly ridiculous, then waved her hand and said, "Take it. What would you need a business book for anyway? Just don't leave it lying around my house." Amara had said, "Thank you, ma'am," and taken the book to her room and opened it that same night. She was on chapter 7. She did not hear the back door open. She did not hear the footsteps in the corridor. So when a voice said, not loudly but clearly enough, "Is that a Kotler textbook?" she knocked the borrowed book off the table with her elbow, knocked the plastic chair with her knee standing up too fast, and knocked her own shin against the table leg in the process, which she was quite sure no business textbook had ever prepared anyone for. She spun around, pressing her hand to her shin, and found a man standing in the doorway of her room, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked like it was deciding whether to be serious or amused and had settled temporarily on both, wearing a jacket that was too nice for midnight and holding a set of car keys. "Sorry," he said, holding up one hand. "I did not mean to frighten you. I am Kwame, Margaret's nephew. I just arrived from Pretoria, and I was getting water from the kitchen, and I saw your light. The door was open. I was not trying to intrude." Amara straightened up, picked the book off the floor, put it back on the table, pulled her cardigan tighter across her chest, and looked at this Kwame person with the full weight of someone who has had a very long day and does not have the energy for complications. "The kitchen is that way," she said, pointing left. He blinked. Then, slowly, the amused side of his face won. "It is," he agreed. "You are right, good night then." And he stepped back, and she heard him go down the corridor, and she heard the tap run, and she sat back down, picked up her book, and told herself that whatever that was, it was nothing. It was a man getting water. It did not matter. Chapter 7 was waiting. But she read the same paragraph 4 times before it went in. 3 weeks later, the letter came.
Enjoying the story, right? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more interesting stories. Now let's get back to the story.
It came on a Tuesday, which was already a strange day because Mrs. Dlamini had woken up in a slightly better mood than usual, possibly because her friend from the church had called to gossip, and slightly better for Mrs. Dlamini meant she had only criticized Amara twice before 10 in the morning instead of 5 times, which felt almost like a holiday. The letter was from Layla. Amara read it standing in the corridor outside her room, still in her work clothes, and her hands started shaking before she was even halfway through, not with fear, with something so big and so warm it did not have a proper name, only a feeling, the feeling of a thing you have been holding your breath for finally arriving. Layla had graduated, with honors, top of her faculty, with a corporate job offer in Cape Town already signed and sealed, starting in 6 weeks. Amara sat down on the floor right there in the corridor, back against the wall, letter in both hands, and cried the way you cry when something good happens that you were not sure you were allowed to believe in, loudly at first, then quietly, then with a smile so wide it made her face ache. She did not care that the floor was cold. She did not care that Mrs. Dlamini might walk by and say something about it. She sat there and let herself feel it, every single ounce of it, for years of early mornings and swallowed words and flickering bulbs and one meal a day and torn shoes, and you people, all of it was worth it, because Layla had made it, Layla had made it, Layla had made it. She began packing that same evening. Small things first, the photograph of her mother, the notebook, the library book she needed to return, the few clothes she owned folded into the same bag she had arrived with 2 years ago, a bag that had not gotten any fuller because she had spent everything she earned on someone else's future. She did not know exactly what came next for her. She did not have a plan beyond leaving. But for the first time in 4 years, she was about to live a life that was entirely, completely, undeniably her own. And standing in that small room with the flickering bulb and the window facing a wall, Amara Dubé smiled to herself and decided that whatever came next, she was ready. She had been practicing courage for years. It was finally her turn to use it for herself. The receptionist at Layla's office building was the kind of woman who had perfected the art of looking at someone and deciding their worth in under 3 seconds. And from the way her eyes traveled from Amara's face down to her worn sandals and back up again, it was clear that Amara had not scored particularly well. "Your name," she said, not asked. "Amara Dubé. I am here to see Layla Dubé. She is my sister. I do not have an appointment, but if you could just let her know I am here. I have traveled from Johannesburg, and I wanted to surprise her. She just started working here, and—" One moment. The receptionist picked up her phone, turned slightly away from Amara as though the conversation was classified information, spoke quietly into it, listened, then put it down and turned back with the specific expression of someone delivering news they are personally enjoying. "Miss Dubé left instructions that visitors without appointments are not to be directed upstairs. If you would like to wait outside, she will come down when she is available." Amara stood very still. "She left instructions," Amara repeated, not as a question, just as a sentence she needed to hear herself say out loud to confirm she had understood it correctly. "Outside, please. There is a bench to the right of the entrance." The Cape Town wind outside was doing exactly what Cape Town wind does, which is behave as though it has a personal grievance against whoever is standing in it, and Amara sat on the bench and pulled her jacket across her chest and watched the glass doors of the building and tried very hard not to think about what kind of instructions a person leaves for a sister who scrubbed floors for 4 years to put her through university. She waited 40 minutes. She counted them. Then the glass doors opened and Layla walked out, and Amara's heart did something complicated because her little sister looked incredible, fitted blazer, heels that added 3 inches to the height she had always been self-conscious about, hair done in a way that probably cost more than Amara's entire bag of belongings, and for 1 full second Amara just felt pure uncomplicated pride, the kind that lives in the chest and makes the eyes go soft. Then Layla's face registered, and it was not the face of someone who was surprised or happy or even guilty. It was the face of someone dealing with an inconvenience they had already anticipated. "Amara," Layla said, stopping a full 2 arm lengths away, not moving to hug her, not smiling, just standing there with her expensive handbag held in front of her like a small shield. "What are you doing here?" Not a question, a complaint shaped like a question. "I wanted to surprise you," Amara said, and she heard her own voice come out softer than she intended, the way voices go when the body already knows something the mind is still refusing to accept. "I wanted to celebrate with you. I thought we could get lunch. I have not seen you in—" "Amara, I am at work." "I know. I was going to wait until your lunch break. I do not mind waiting. I have been waiting outside for 40. "You cannot just show up here," Layla said, and her voice had dropped, not with emotion, with something that sounded horribly close to embarrassment, and she glanced briefly at the glass doors behind her as though checking whether any of her colleagues were watching. "I have a position here. I have an image to maintain. I cannot have people just appearing at my workplace unannounced." Amara looked at her sister, at this woman in the blazer and the heels, and something shifted in her chest, something quiet and irreversible, like a door closing on a hinge that had been loose for a while. "People," Amara said. Layla had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable, just briefly. Then she opened her handbag and took out an envelope, a white envelope that she had clearly prepared before coming downstairs, which meant she had known this moment was coming, which meant she had planned it, which meant that while Amara was on a bus from Johannesburg to Cape Town counting down the hours to seeing her sister, Layla was in this building preparing an exit strategy. She held the envelope out. "There is 3,000 rand in there," Layla said. "It is enough to start something small, a catering thing, or a cleaning service. You are good at that kind of work. You can build something from it. I am not ungrateful, Amara. I know what you did, but we are in different places now, and I think it is better if we give each other space to grow. Amara looked at the envelope. She looked at it for a long time. 3,000 rand, for 4 years, for torn shoes and 1 meal a day and a flickering bulb, and you people 6 mornings a week and a borrowed textbook read at midnight. 3,000 rand in a white envelope held out at arm's length by the person she had done all of it for. She took the envelope, because her hands moved before her brain gave permission, and then she stood on that pavement and watched Layla turn around in her expensive heels, pull open the glass door, and walk back into the building without once looking back, not at the door, not through the glass, not once. The door closed, and Amara stood there. The Cape Town wind pushed at her from the left. A car honked somewhere behind her. A pigeon landed near her feet and looked up at her with the blank optimism of a creature that has never been betrayed by anyone, and Amara stood on that pavement with a white envelope in her hand and felt something she had never felt before, not grief, not anger, not even sadness exactly, something colder than all of those. The specific feeling of looking down and realizing the ground you built everything on was never as solid as you thought. Her hands were shaking. She noticed them shaking the way you notice things from far away, with mild, distant curiosity, as though they belonged to someone else. Hey, are you okay? She did not look up immediately because the Cape Town wind was making her eyes water, and she needed another second before she was willing to show her face to a stranger. I am fine, thank you, she said to the pavement. You are shaking, the voice said, closer now, not pushy, not intrusive, just honest in the way that people are honest when they are actually concerned rather than performing concern. And you have been standing in the same spot for about 4 minutes. I was parking my car, and I watched you not move. That is not the behavior of someone who is fine. She looked up. It took her a moment, because the last time she had seen this face it was filling a doorway at midnight in a Santon mansion with car keys in one hand and a question about a Kotler textbook on its lips. But it was the same face, same broad shoulders, same expression of someone deciding between serious and amused, except this time serious was winning comfortably. Kwame. You, she said. He blinked, looked at her more carefully, and then recognition landed on his face with visible surprise. The textbook, the midnight reader, Mrs. Dlamini's, you are. Amara, she said. Amara, he repeated, and then he looked at her properly, at the envelope in her shaking hands, at her eyes which were doing their absolute best and not entirely succeeding, and his expression shifted into something that had no agenda in it whatsoever. Come, let me buy you tea. There is a place just around the corner. You do not have to talk if you do not want to. You can just sit somewhere warm. She almost said no. She had her mouth arranged around no. But the wind pushed at her again, and her hands were still shaking, and the pigeon had wandered off having correctly assessed that she had nothing to offer it. And Amara looked at this man she had met once in a corridor and thought, with the particular exhausted clarity of someone who has just had everything she believed in handed back to her in an envelope, that she was very tired of standing alone in the cold. Okay, she said. The tea place was small and warm and smelled like cinnamon and roasted coffee beans, and Kwame ordered 2 teas without asking her what kind, because he had glanced at the menu and correctly understood that this was not a moment for decisions, and they sat across from each other at a corner table, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then Amara looked down at the white envelope on the table between them and started talking. She told him everything. Not in order, not neatly. The way you tell things when they have been sitting inside you for too long and the container finally cracks, her mother dying, the 2-room house in Soweto, Layla's matric results and the acceptance letter, and the decision she made at 18 that seemed obvious then and felt devastating now. The 2 years at Mrs. Dlamini's, the torn shoes, the 1 meal a day, the flickering bulb, the notebook, the midnight reading, all of it spilling out across that corner table between small sips of tea that she kept forgetting to take until it went cold. Kwame listened. Not in the way people listen when they are waiting for a gap to put their own story in. Not in the way people listen when they are composing advice. Just actually, genuinely listening, his hands around his mug, his eyes on her face, the occasional small nod that said, I am still here, keep going. When she finally stopped, the tea was cold and the place was emptier than when they had come in, and Kwame was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, a thinking quiet, the kind that respects what it just received. She prepared the envelope before she came downstairs, he said. Yes, Amara said. He nodded slowly, and something moved across his face that was too controlled to be anger, but was definitely related to it. She knew you were coming, and she prepared an exit strategy. Yes. Okay, he said, and he picked up his cold tea, looked into it briefly as though it owed him something, then put it back down. Then here is what I think, not about her, about you. You are sitting across from me right now with 4 years of management knowledge in your head from a textbook you read at midnight, with the discipline of someone who chose hard every single morning for 4 years, and with 3,000 rand in an envelope that someone handed you thinking it was the end of your story. Amara looked at him. It is not the end of your story, he said simply. And Amara sat in that small, warm, cinnamon-smelling tea shop in Cape Town with cold tea in front of her and a white envelope on the table, and looked at this man who had no reason to be kind to her and felt something shift inside her chest again, different from the shift outside the glass building. This one going in the opposite direction, something opening rather than closing, small and careful but real. She had spent 4 years pouring every drop of herself into Layla, every rand, every meal she skipped, every night she stayed awake, every insult she swallowed, all of it poured into a vessel that had just handed it back in an envelope and walked away on expensive heels. She was not going to beg for it back. She was not going to call Layla and cry. She was not going to show up at that building again. She was not going to spend one more minute of her life waiting for someone to recognize what she was worth. She picked up the white envelope, turned it over in her hands once, and put it in her bag. 3,000 rand, she thought, was actually a reasonable amount to start something small. Not a cleaning service. Not anything that kept her on her knees. Something of her own, something with her name on it. Something that in 5 years would make people in expensive blazers look up from their desks. She looked across the table at Kwame, who was watching her with the quiet attention of someone who understood that a decision was being made and had the good sense not to interrupt it. I am going to need a business registration office, she said. And possibly another cup of tea. This one went cold while I was busy falling apart. Kwame looked at her for a moment, and then that face finally settled fully on amused, a real smile, the kind that changes the whole shape of a person's face. I know where both of those are, he said, and raised his hand to call the waiter. The business registration office smelled like old paper and bureaucratic patience, and the woman behind the counter looked at Amara's form with the expression of someone who had processed 10,000 dreams and was not easily impressed by another one. Business name, she said. Ithemba, Amara said, without hesitating, because she had decided it on the walk over, the Zulu word for hope, the thing that had survived everything else. Kwame, standing slightly behind her, said nothing, but she heard him exhale quietly in a way that sounded like approval. That was the beginning. The first 6 months were the kind of difficult that does not make for a romantic story while you are inside it, only after, when you are on the other side and can afford to look back and say, that was character building, without wanting to throw something. Amara worked at a small catering company in the city from 6 in the morning, not scrubbing floors this time, but in a kitchen, actually cooking, and the head chef, a large cheerful woman named Mama Fatima, who wore the same red head wrap every single day and claimed it was lucky, took one look at Amara on her first morning and said, You cook like someone who learned in a real kitchen, not a fancy school. I can use you. It was the best compliment anyone had given her in years. In the evenings, she went to her part-time business management classes at a college across town, sitting in a classroom with people 10 years younger than her who had laptops and energy drinks and had never had to choose between buying a textbook and eating, and she took notes in the same kind of notebook she had always used, the same handwriting, the same hunger. Except now there was no flickering bulb, and nobody was going to knock on her door and tell her the guest bathroom needed attention. Kwame helped her in the ways that did not feel like charity, which was the only kind of help Amara would accept, pointing her toward a free legal clinic that handled small business registrations, forwarding her a link to a market vendor application without commentary, showing up at her first market stall on a Saturday morning with 2 cups of coffee and the practical observation that her signage was too small to read from the road. She made him stand at the road and squint at it himself to confirm, and he did, with complete seriousness, because that was the kind of person he was, the kind who does not offer opinions he is not willing to demonstrate. They did not talk about what they were to each other. There was no conversation with definitions and declarations. They just kept showing up for each other in small, consistent ways until showing up became the definition itself. By month 8, Ithemba Catering had its own logo, its own social media page that Amara ran herself at 11 at night, its own small but growing list of clients, and its own reputation in certain circles for the kind of food that made people go quiet mid-bite, which Mama Fatima said was the highest possible compliment a dish could receive. When the table goes silent, Mama Fatima always said, waving a wooden spoon for emphasis, that is not rudeness, that is religion. Then came the Abrahams' wedding. The Abrahams were the kind of Cape Town family whose events got photographed for magazines. Not because they hired photographers, but because photographers showed up anyway, and when their daughter Zoe decided she wanted her wedding catered by a small black-owned brand she had found online because, as she told her mother firmly, I want real food at my wedding, not hotel food that tastes like a conference. Her mother had called the number on the Athemba page with the specific energy of someone doing their child a favor they expected to regret. She did not regret it. 400 guests, 3 courses, a dessert table that a food blogger photographed and posted before the bride had even cut the cake, and by Sunday morning Athemba Catering was in the caption of a post with 60,000 likes and a magazine editor's assistant in the comments asking for contact details. Amara found out sitting on her kitchen floor at 6 in the morning because she had woken up to her phone making sounds it had never made before, picked it up expecting something wrong, and instead found notifications stacking on top of each other like the phone was trying to tell her something urgent and could not stop talking. She sat on the kitchen floor for a full 10 minutes just scrolling. Then she called Kwame. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he had already seen it. Your signage, he said before she could speak, is no longer too small. She laughed so hard she had to put the phone down. The magazine feature came 3 weeks later, a full page with a photograph of Amara in her kitchen, arms crossed, looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who has earned every single thing behind her, and the headline read, From nothing to Athemba, the Cape Town caterer everyone is talking about. She bought 6 copies. She sent one to Mama Fatima, who called her immediately and cried, then denied crying, then cried again. She kept one for herself and put it on the table next to her mother's photograph. The call from Layla came on a Wednesday. Amara was in the middle of a stock count when her phone's screen lit up with a number she had not deleted but had not called either, and she looked at it for 3 rings, not with anger, just with the steady clarity of someone who has done their grieving already and come out the other side into something quieter. She picked up. Amara, Layla said, and her voice had something in it that the voice outside the glass building had not had, something unsteady, something that had been rehearsed but was not holding together as planned. I saw the article. I have been trying to find the right time to call. I am proud of you. Amara put down her clipboard, leaned against the kitchen counter, and was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Layla, she said, and she meant it, without performance, without bitterness, just plainly. I want to explain, about Cape Town, about what happened. I was scared and I was stupid and I handled it badly, and I know that is not enough, but Layla, Amara said, gently but clearly, the way you speak to someone when you want them to actually hear you. I forgive you, genuinely, I have forgiven you for a while now, but forgiveness is not the same as picking up where we left off. I need peace more than I need an explanation, and right now my peace does not include pretending that envelope did not happen. Silence on the line. I hope you build something good, Amara continued. I hope your job is everything you wanted, and I hope you are kind to the next person who loves you the way I did, because that kind of love deserves to be treated carefully. Layla made a sound on the other end that was too small and too broken to be called anything other than what it was, and Amara felt something for her sister in that moment, not the old fierce protective love, something smaller and more honest, the ordinary human sadness of watching someone understand too late what they threw away. Take care of yourself, Amara said, and ended the call. She stood in her kitchen for a moment, hands still on the counter, and noticed that she felt fine, not triumphant, not sad, just fine, the way you feel when you have finally put down something heavy you carried for so long you forgot it was not supposed to be yours. She picked up her clipboard and went back to her stock count. The first anniversary celebration of Athemba Catering was held at a venue in the city that Amara had catered twice before and was therefore getting at a discount, because she had learned in business school and from Mama Fatima that knowing the right people and feeding them well were essentially the same strategy. The room was full of people who had believed in Athemba from early clients, the food blogger, Mama Fatima in her red head wrap holding a glass of sparkling water and supervising everyone else's enjoyment. the college classmates who had watched her take notes by hand while they typed, the woman from the market who had let Amara use her extension cord on the first stall Saturday. And somewhere near the back of the room, 3 women who had worked in the same domestic employment agency as Amara, who had scrubbed floors in Santon and Rosebank and Houghton, who had come to Cape Town for this evening because Amara had personally called each of them and said, "I want people who know where I started to be there when I celebrate where I am." Amara was in the middle of a conversation near the food table when the room went quiet. Not the conference food quiet, not the polite quiet, the specific sudden quiet of a room where everyone has noticed something at the same time and is holding their breath about it. She turned around. Kwame was on one knee in the middle of the room, in the good jacket, the one he saved for things that mattered, with a small box open in his hand and an expression on his face that had finally completely, irrevocably settled on one thing and one thing only. The room stayed quiet. Amara looked at him, at this man who had found her shaking on a pavement with an envelope in her hand and bought her tea and let her talk and pointed her toward a registration office and stood at the road squinting at her signage and showed up, kept showing up, in the small consistent ways that turned out to be the loudest kind of love. "I had a whole speech," he said from the floor, with the slight breathlessness of someone who had rehearsed something and abandoned it in real time. "But you are looking at me like that, and I have forgotten all of it. So I am just going to say that I would very much like to be the person who shows up for the rest of your life, if you will let me." Mama Fatima, from somewhere in the back, said, "Say yes, child," in a voice that suggested this was not a request. Amara laughed, the real kind, the kind that starts in the stomach and has no self-consciousness in it at all, and the whole room laughed with her, and she looked at Kwame still on the floor with his box and his forgotten speech and his absolute sincerity and walked toward him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes, get up from that floor." The room erupted. Mama Fatima was definitely crying and definitely denying it. Later, much later, when the venue was emptying and the caterers, her caterers, were clearing up, Amara stood near the window with Kwame's arm around her shoulders and looked at the room, at the people who had eaten her food and celebrated her name and witnessed this evening, and thought about the girl who had sat on a cold corridor floor in Soweto reading a letter by a flickering bulb with torn shoes and an empty stomach, and the fierce, unreasonable belief that it would be worth it. She had not known then what worth it would look like. She knew now. It looked like this room, and this man, and her mother's photograph on a table next to a magazine with her own face in it, and a business with her name on it, and 3 women from a domestic agency laughing near the dessert table, and a red headwrap moving through the crowd, and a word that meant hope stamped on everything she had built. Ithemba. She had started with nothing except the kind of love that does not know when to quit, and she had turned it, slowly and stubbornly and on her own terms, into everything. And nobody, not an envelope, not a glass door, not a cold pavement, not a flickering bulb, not a single person who had ever looked at her and decided her worth in under 3 seconds. Nobody had been able to take that from her. Nobody ever would. The end.